Well, what I found interesting in this context, and that's really what I was trying to do in the second book, in the story of a great medieval book, what I found interesting was the rhythm of the commentary tradition, rhythm or the structure of the commentary tradition. So at that point, I was studying the commentaries on the Book of Sentences as an example of the development of Catholic tradition, and then later on I wrote a book on Catholic tradition and what it is, because you see, so there are, of course, in particular right now, there are many theoretical discussions regarding the nature of tradition.
Yes.
This is very interesting, of course, but it becomes very interesting when you take a particular example of the development of tradition, which is, by the way, also the method that Newman used in his own study of tradition. So not simply a theory, but how do we, in the development, let's say, of things like the discussion about Arianism and things like that, how do we actually see tradition developing and orthodoxy coming to be distinguished from heterodoxy? And so I took the case of the commentaries on the Book of Sentences in order to study the unfolding of an important aspect of Catholic tradition. And the rhythm that I found is a rhythm that one could say is the rhythm of a growth of concentric circles that come to be further and further removed from their center until the outer layers of this series of concentric circles come to be so far removed from the center that a return to the center is deemed necessary. The center is, of course, Scripture, because theology develops around Scripture, but at least kind of the theoretical development revolves around Scripture. Spiritually, of course, perhaps Scripture is just a little bit less important, because there's also the Eucharist, there's liturgy, etc., that enter the picture. But at any rate, let's say Scripture is at the center of that tradition, and at the heart of Scripture, it's the person of Jesus Christ himself, actually. And then you get layers of interpretation. You already, in the first perhaps 2 minutes of our conversation, you drew attention to the fact that the New Testament itself already has elements of theological reflection, not just of gospel narrative, but of theological reflection. So one could say that Scripture itself already has a layer of commentary there, of theological commentary. Then you get something like the Church Fathers who one could say explicitate the implicit. That's certainly one thing that's going on. What are the doctrines that are implicit in Scripture that are, however, not spelled out in Scripture? The most famous case is, of course, that of the Trinity, in that the term Trinity is obviously not a scriptural term. Nonetheless, there is in the New Testament talk of the Father and of the Son and of the Spirit. And by the way, medieval theologians thought there was talk of these three in the Old Testament as well. So, but
right.
there you go. So the implicit gets explicitated, then theologians are beginning to, for example, think of the relationship among the four Gospels, where you have already a situation where you have different voices articulating the same truth, but different voices that have to be reconciled. So the theological tradition develops further and further. Then something that you mentioned that is indeed very important is the injection, if you will, of the Aristotelian tradition, which occurs towards the end of the 13th, and then at the end of the 12th, and then in the 13th century, which makes possible Thomas Aquinas. So our concentric circles grow further. Now we have an attempt to articulate the Christian faith in terms not only of Scripture and the Church Fathers, but in terms of Aristotelian philosophy. And this grows further and further and further, until, and this is not an exclusively Protestant phenomenon, in the 14th and 15th centuries, theologians begin to realize that they have come to be so removed, that they are operating in such thin conceptual air, that theology has come to be spiritually impoverished. It's now about the 5 different meanings of the term incarnation, and how the 5 different meanings, blah, 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 very logical treatises that go on for hundreds of pages certainly without any clear spiritual benefit. And at that point you see a return to Scripture, a desire to, by the way, in the case of the Book of Sentences, interestingly enough, in the 15th century, you have commentators who will make commentaries on Peter Lombard again. Because the commentaries on the Book of Sentences have come to be so far removed from the Book of Sentences that the first step, for example, made by Dennis the Carthusian, who, by the way, is a super, super, super interesting author who is really neglected.
Yes.
And the main reason
Of
why he's neglected is...
all of the commentators on the sentences you described, the one I most want to read is Dennis's commentary, because it is a synthesis of the most important pre-nominalist commentators on the sentences, and also because of other things you described, such as a concern about integrating theology with the spiritual life.
Absolutely.
And he just seems like a very, very interesting figure in general. He's referenced by Father John Sayward in his books a lot as well.
To return to this whole idea of the structure of tradition, there seems to be this movement, if you will, of expansion and contraction. Mm-hmm. You could apply it even to the Second Vatican Council. So the Second Vatican Council also had this idea that there had been a lot of theological discussion really in the wake of the First Vatican Council and also of Aeterni Patris, but a loss of sight of the rich theological richness of the Church Fathers. So I think one way of, not the only way, not exclusive, but one way of looking at the Second Vatican Council is to say that it wants to return in the liturgy, but also in theology, to neglected sources, namely the Church Fathers, including the Greek Church Fathers, who had been left behind by an expanding tradition of theological discourse. I think it's also, a remark that you made early on was, let's say if you're a reader of Thomas Aquinas, you also have to be a reader of Scripture. I think that's absolutely true, precisely because you want to make sure that your theological thinking remains, well, tied to Scripture as a formal description, remains relevant and connected with a living faith that is nourished from the reading of Scripture itself.